Have you ever had a dream that you were just absolutely convinced that just meant something? That, like, you told someone, again, you thought it was something that was amazing. You woke up being like, oh man, something was substantial about that dream, and then you went and you told someone about it, and they just stared at you like you're crazy. You ever have one of those moments? Dreams can really be strange like that, right? Sometimes they're just random, sometimes they're forgettable, and other times they feel like they're just incredibly real, like so real that you wake up thinking, is that dream trying to tell me something here? Well, now imagine being a teenager and having a dream that seemed to say something pretty bold. Not just a strange dream, but a dream that suggested that one day that your entire family would bow down to you. And then imagine doing what Joseph does in our story this morning. Tell your older brothers about it. Now again, think about that family conversation for a second. Joseph he's 17 years old. He is one of the youngest kids. He gathers all of his older brothers together and basically says, hey guys, I had this dream where you're going to all bow down to me. How do you think that went? Not well, right? If you've ever had a sibling rivalry in your life, just picture that and imagine this by a million times more, right? Joseph's brothers were already frustrated with him. They're already jealous of him. They're already convinced that their father loved him even more than them. Now Joseph starts talking about these dreams where he rules over them. And from that moment on, the tension in the family goes from something that's just kind of uncomfortable to explosive. Here's the fascinating thing. What first looks as just another, messy family drama, is actually something much bigger than that. Because when we step back and look carefully at his life, we begin to see that his story is pointing beyond itself. Actually pointing forward to someone. Today we're in the middle of a 3-week series called True and Better, where we're looking at a few familiar Old Testament stories. And again, I love the Old Testament, and one of the main reasons why I love it is that we see Jesus just permeate all throughout the pages of the Old Testament. He's everywhere. He's on every single page. And that's not just reading into the biblical text in those passages. It's actually what Jesus has said himself. If you were here last week, I gave you what Jesus said in John 5. He says, hey, religious leaders. In John 5, he says, you think that studying the scriptures give you life. That's not true. It's actually Jesus says the scriptures testify about me. I give you life. And this week, I want to give you another quote from Luke 24. In Luke 24, Jesus has already rose from the dead, and now there's this couple of no-name folks that are heading to this town called Emmaus. On the way there, Jesus shows up and he says a few things that we read here in verses 25 through 27. So Jesus said to them, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Not the Messiah had to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning. Again, Jesus, he's walking with these guys, and he's like, hey, here I am in this Old Testament story, and here I am in that one, and here I am in this one. So from Moses, which is the law, all the way through the prophets, he says, I'm there. I'm there. And even a few verses later, which I'm not going to look at, he even says that the Psalms testify about me. The totality of Scripture is pointing to Jesus. All the Old Testament is Scripture saying someone is coming. And even the Gospels comes and says, hey, he's here, that someone is here. And then we read Acts, and it's about proclamation that someone's come. Let's tell people about it. The epistles are all about, let's tell people who this someone is. Let's explain about him. Then we get to the last letter, Revelation, and that's someone, basically the letter says that someone is going to come to wrap everything up. And the totality of Scripture is all about Jesus. He's the main character, and that's what we're going to be looking at these couple of weeks. Today our passage is in Genesis chapter 37, so feel free to turn there in your Bibles. You can pull up on your smartphones. In your sermon notes in your bulletins, list the page numbers of the pew Bibles that are right in front of you, or you can follow along on the screen. And so while you turn there, I've already given a little bit of a glimpse of where we're going today. Genesis chapter 37 all the way to 50 is about the life of Joseph. We're not going to go through all those chapters here this morning, but again, Joseph is a remarkable person. And in Joseph's story, we're going to see something that's called typology. And Joseph is basically, he's a type. He's a shadow or a figure pointing to someone who's coming that's going to be better. And Joseph is like a little action figure that the actual person is based on. An actual person. So our title for our sermon today is that Jesus is the true and better. Like when we looked at last week that Jesus is the true and better Isaac, just like, Jesus is the true and better Adam, that he's the true and better Moses, that he's the true and better David. The true and better for us. And that leads us to our big idea for today. That Jesus is our true and better Joseph who was sent by the Father to call us back to him for relief, comfort. Big idea. So let's dig into Genesis chapter 37. And the first thing that you notice here in this passage is that Joseph is an obedient and righteous son. We read this in verse 2. Now this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report. Like I mentioned earlier, Joseph, he's one of the younger brothers. He's actually the 11th of 12 sons that Jacob had. And what we see from this verse is that, Joseph was a good son. He's a good one. He's an obedient son. He's a loyal son. He's a righteous son. We see here in verse 2 that this is a contrast to his brothers. Joseph had to go tell his father on his brothers that these brothers were not obedient. They were not righteous people. They were unrighteous. We're meant to see that contrast right here at the beginning of Genesis 37. But he's not just obedient. He's not just a good son. He's also something else. See that he's loved and also elevated. The Father loves and elevates us. Read this here in verse 3. It says, now Israel, which is another name for Jacob, Dad loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and made an ornate robe for him. Another way to translate ornate robe was a coat of many colors. You may even call it a Technicolor dream coat if you like. But again, this gift is actually significant. It's not a small gift. It's not like going to Target and buying your kids or grandkids a colorful coat. It's not like that at all. The coat that Jacob actually gives Joseph is a coat of an esteemed position. He's elevating Joseph by giving this coat. By giving Joseph this long-sleeved cloak, Jacob is basically bestowing authority to him. In other words, this coat symbolizes that when Jacob wants something done, that Joseph is the man to get it done. Another way to put that is Joseph is now the visible expression of the Father's very much demonstrated by giving him this. Now, technically, who should this robe go to? Joseph have this thing as the 11th born son? He could have it. Firstborn, right? His name is Reuben. What do you know about Reuben besides it being a questionable sandwich? Okay, they were good. You got a joke. I'm sure I'll hear about that after the service for the folks that like Reubens. Again, Reuben, if you read the other passages of Genesis, he's not an honorable person. In that group of folks right at the beginning, brothers that were dishonorable, that were not righteous, that they were disobedient. So basically, he didn't get the esteemed position. So in a way, by Jacob giving Joseph this coat, he's making Joseph his firstborn. Joseph, he's now the leader of the pack. He's going to be that physical representation of what the Father desires. Again, the 11th child, he's going to lead his older siblings. How do you think they're going to feel about that? They don't like it. Older kids, they don't want to serve the younger ones. Joseph, he's righteous, he's loved, he's elevated. What else do we see here? Joseph is hated because of his obedience. His brothers, they don't like him. Not one little bit. And we read this in verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. Could not speak a kind word. Despise him. They loathed him. Because he was loved more by the Father, right? They can't even speak a single kind word to him when he's in their presence. Nothing good comes out of their mouth when Joseph is around. There's just a significant enmity between him and his siblings. They don't like him. They don't like him because, again, his father loves him more, but because he's also his righteousness, obedience. They don't like him because he's been elevated. They don't like him because he's been that visible representation of what the Father desires and what he wants. And what the Father speaks. And when the Father wants something done, he does it. They hate him for another reason. They hate him because of his outlandish claims. We read this in verses 5 through 8. It says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to him, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Verse 8. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will he actually rule over us? They hated him all the more because of his dream. Again, they're thinking, the brothers at this moment are thinking, can I even hate this person even more? Like, yep, I can. I can now. And there's another reason why we don't like you. Now, Joseph could have said this a little bit nicer, or maybe kept it to himself. Maybe. But, again, they don't like his dreams. What are these dreams? They're actually prophetic words from God. And the brothers, they see it. They can interpret this dream as well as Joseph can, right? Interpretation is this, that Joseph is going to be their ruler son. They hate Joseph's prophetic words because he's going to be their coming ruler. They're going to have to bow down and bend their knees to him. So it's not just the brothers that are going to bow down. If we read verses 9 through 11, we see actually it's going to be the entire family that's going to do that. The entire family will one day bow in front of. In verse 12, we see that his father has a mission. Since Joseph is obedient and does what his father asks, he doesn't say no to his father's request. Joseph is faithful to his father's call, to the father's mission. What is he going to do? He's going to seek wandering brothers. The son's now going to be sent on a mission to pursue his brother. Well, because these brothers are moving further and further away from the. Read this in verses 12 all the way down to 17. It says, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to him. Very well. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. And he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Joseph arrived at Shechem. A man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are, grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. Joseph went after his brothers and found them near. So the father, he's concerned about his sons. He's concerned about the brothers of Joseph. So he sends his other son, tells him to go find them, right? Sends the good son on behalf of the disobedience. So these sons, these brothers, are supposed to be in Shechem. Not there. They need to move further and further away, actually, from the father. How do you think this is going to go right now? As the father sends this obedient, this righteous, this loved son to his wayward brothers, how are the brothers going to respond? This in verses 18. They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of it. So again, they see that he's far away.
right? They see that he's coming towards them, and they don't want anything to do with him. They don't want him, his pursuit of him. They loathe him. They loathe him so much, and to kill him. Plot against him. Again, we have these wayward brothers. Not only do they hate him, they think that the best thing that could happen to them, the best thing that can happen to this brother, is for him to die. Get rid of the son. Let's get rid of this wannabe ruler. Let's get rid of this pursuer of us. All will be great. This in verses 21 and 22. It says, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hand. Do not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back. And this is very interesting right here. And remember, Reuben is that firstborn, not a questionable sandwich, but he's the firstborn here. And he seems like he wants to intervene, right? But no, as a firstborn, he could have really just immediately stopped, right? Could have. But he does do a little second plan right there in order to try to rescue Peter. What's he doing right here? Reuben, he's not being strong, he's not being courageous, he's being weak, being immoral. What he's trying to do, he's trying to appease different groups of people. He's trying to still stay on the good side of his brothers, still be on the positive side of his brothers, look good for them. But he's also, about Joseph, he's trying to really regain favor of his father. He wants to regain that number one position. So he's trying to do something manipulative and sneak behind the scenes. This isn't about saving Joseph's life just because he cares for Joseph. He's just like one of his other brothers. He hates him. But he's trying to do this in order to regain that status. Let's see what happens when Joseph gets to his brothers, verses 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down, again, they strip him. They put their hands on him. I'm sure at this moment, especially from what they've said earlier, they're probably mocking him. They're probably mocking him in his dreams and all these type of things. They're not silent. They throw him into this pit, this empty cistern. There's no water in there. So while he's there in the cistern with no water, probably thirsty, probably bruised and beaten up, what are they doing? Celebrating. There's an all-out contempt for this brother. There's a contempt against the one who's pursued them. When we read this, what happens in verse 20? They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to eat. On the surface, this kind of seems kind of irrelevant. I think this is kind of important. It's vital. So again, there's this caravan of Gentiles, Ishmaelites. They're heading somewhere. They're heading to Egypt. And they're going to Egypt and they're bringing stuff with them. They're bringing these goods. Well, first, it's stuff that Egypt doesn't have, and so it needs these. And these things are also very important. These goods were valuable commodities in the ancient world for things for healing and comfort and restoration. In other words, this caravan was carrying things that would bring relief to the people. Then we read this in verses 26. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed. But when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him. Now we see another brother show up, Judah. And Judah, again, he doesn't want to kill, but wants to betray him. He basically says, let's let the Gentiles take care of it. Again, he's our brother. We don't want to do ourselves.
Let's let the Gentiles do the dirty work for us. We'll wash our hands. So Judas says, Judas is the one who's going to betray his brother. He's actually going to sell him for a couple pieces of silver. So right now we see that this true son is betrayed, placed in the hands of Jesus. Heading to I think it's so interesting that this group of Gentiles is going down to Egypt. They're carrying these goods there, and they're bringing all these forms of comfort and relief with them. They're also bringing this individual, Joseph, you know this full story, who's going to bring relief and comfort and healing. And that should sound familiar, right? Again, this is why Joseph is a type, like I mentioned earlier. This is why in Genesis 37 we see typology all over the place. This is the exact story of Jesus, right? Jesus was hated. He was betrayed. He was handed over by his brothers. They didn't kill him. He was killed by the Gentiles. Remember in Pentecost in Acts chapter 2? And Peter, he's preaching this message, and he looks at his Jewish brothers, and he says this. This man, Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and help of wicked men, which are the Gentiles, put him to death by nailing him. And you might not have done it yourself, but you handed him over to the Gentiles, and they did it. Again, you're just as guilty. Now, of course, we know the story that for Joseph, it didn't end with him being sold. Because even though that Jesus is rejected by his brothers, betrayed for silver, and handed over to the Gentiles, God is still at work. That Joseph is going to eventually rise to a position of authority in Egypt. And through him, God's going to bring relief to a people who are facing famine. And Joseph will become the one who provides goods and life and hope to those who come to him in need. Familiar, right? Joseph is a type going forward to Jesus. Again, Jesus was rejected by his own people. He was betrayed by pieces of silver. He was handed over to the Gentiles. He suffered and was put to death. The story didn't end there. God raised him up from dead and exalted him to life. Now Jesus stands in a far greater position than Joseph ever did. Joseph provided bread that sustained people for a season. Jesus provides life that lasts forever. Joseph brought relief from physical famine. Jesus brings a very soul. Joseph pointed forward to a greater by Jesus, better Joseph. By the gospel. Jesus still offers life to the. Now as we continue on Joseph's story, we know this is not the end for him. Like I said before, Genesis 37 closes by telling us this in verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Again, Joseph, he's betrayed by his brothers. Now he's going to go to Egypt, and we know that he's going to experience from the story, that he's going to experience more trials and more hardships, and eventually he's going to become second in command. And in those constant trials and constant hardships and injustice, he doesn't run away at all in that story. He continually trusts God. God has promised him something, and he's going to lean into that. It's going to continually persevere, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. Again, let's step back. Look at the picture that we have for us. In Joseph, he's the beloved son of the Father. He's obedient, he's faithful, he's entrusted with authority. He's rejected by the wandering brothers. And through it all, Joseph will eventually become the one who brings relief. And Joseph is just pointing forward. Jesus is a true and better Joseph. The obedient son. He's the beloved son of the Father. The one who perfectly reveals the Father's role, that he was sent by the Father to pursue a wandering world. Today, he offers life to all who comes. But again, Joseph's story doesn't just point us to Jesus. It also gives us real life examples of what it looks like to follow God in the middle of real life. Joseph's life gives us three powerful truths about what it means to walk with God. First, Joseph faithfully waits for God's word to be fulfilled. Joseph receives promises from God through these dreams. Yeah, do these promises come fulfilled right away, right? No, they don't. In fact, the opposite seems to happen for him. The rise into leadership, Joseph's betrayed by his brothers. He's sold into slavery. He's taken away from his home. But in the midst of all those things, what does he do? Trust that if God has spoken, then God's going to be faithful. Even when circumstances look confusing, even when life doesn't make sense, Joseph continues to trust that God is still at work. Many of us, we know what it feels like to wait on God. Right now, you may be waiting for direction from Him. You may be waiting for healing. You might be waiting for a relationship to be restored. You may be waiting for God to move in an area of your life that just feels stuck. And waiting is hard. Waiting can feel like nothing's happening. Waiting can make us question whether God's forgotten us. Joseph reminds us that God is always working, even when we can't see it. A little bit earlier, didn't we? Faith sometimes looks like continuing to trust God while you wait for His word. Joseph's story also is a reminder that sometimes following God faithfully does not make our life easier. Again, Joseph, he's obedient. Joseph is righteous. Joseph does what is right. Yeah, he's hated for it. His brothers betray him. They strip him of his robe. They throw him in a cistern and sell him as a slave. Later on in his life, he's falsely accused and thrown into prison. Joseph experiences betrayal, injustice, deep personal pain. Many of us, what that feels like too. Some of you have been betrayed by someone you've trusted. Yeah, you've trusted. Some of you have experienced unfair treatment. Some of you have felt misunderstood, or you have hurt, or you felt wronged. Walking with God does not mean we're avoiding hardship. Sometimes walking with God means that we experience. Joseph's life reminds us that God's not absent in our suffering. God sees. God knows. God's still painful circumstance. Finally, what makes Joseph's story so powerful is that he doesn't give up on God. That even in the middle of hardship, he continues to trust the Lord. He does not walk away from God when life becomes difficult. He does not grow bitter. He does not stop believing. Instead, he perseveres. This is an important question for us. Where are you struggling to walk with God? Maybe you're struggling to trust God while you wait. Maybe you're struggling because life just feels unfair. Maybe you're struggling because you're tired or discouraged or wounded. Where are you struggling to walk with God? Well, I want you to take a moment, honestly think about that. Here, just in a second, I want to invite you to respond with just that simple commitment before the Lord today. Just a simple I will statement for you to write. Maybe for you, it'll look like, I will trust God even while I wait for His promises. Maybe I'll continue to follow God even when life feels unfair. Maybe for you write down, I will persevere in faith even when circumstances are difficult. Right now, I just encourage you to grab your sermon notes, maybe grab a smartphone if that's easier for you. Take a moment quietly before our Lord and ask yourself this question. What is my I will statement? Finish writing this important thing that we must remember here today. Again, Joseph's story is not ultimately about Joseph. It's pointing us to someone greater. Because while Joseph persevered through suffering, Jesus endured a far greater suffering than Joseph. Joseph was hated by his brothers. Jesus, he was rejected by the world. Joseph was handed over to the Gentiles and put into slavery. Jesus was handed over to the Gentiles and he was crucified. Through that suffering, God was accomplishing something incredible. And Joseph's story was always pointing. Jesus is that true and better Joseph, the one who brings forgiveness, healing, and life to all that would come. Good news of the gospel is this: that even when we struggle to walk with God, even when our faith feels weak, even when we fail, He offers forgiveness for our sin. He offers grace for our weakness. He offers life for those who trust in Him. Wherever you are today, you're waiting, you're hurting, look to Him. Struggling, into Him. Jesus, the true and better Joseph, sent by the Father to call us back to Him for relief. Father in heaven, your word is remarkable in so many ways. More than anything, God, you long for people. Look for you for life, for relief, for comfort, for wholeness. God, if there's any person here that's not trusted you, they lay down their arms. Lay down their ideas of what they can do to gain favor in your eyes. Would they lay down the idea that they are not good enough, that I'm not loved, that I'm not special? Just hear from you this morning. Hear that you love them. That you've done everything that you could possibly do to show and demonstrate that through your Son. But they, by faith, embrace. God, for us, children, help us to not stray from you. Not to look to empty wells that hold no water. We want to encounter you in powerful ways. To be a light to us. Pray us all in Jesus' name.